This is video file number 1 for a report for a property in Treannadullagh, Drumkeeran for Chris Bailey. So now the first thing I want to do is I will go through basically I want to just explain the difference between an older method of construction, which would be solid stone wall construction, which is what you have, and more modern construction, which would have a cavity wall, and this is a more modern construction with a cavity wall. So I just want to quickly explain the difference because it's important, because in your property you have an old stone wall and they can be prone to dampness if they're not treated correctly. So as a bit of background, I'm going to explain the way they work. Historically, an old stone walls were constructed using lime mortar and stone, which breathe, which allow moisture to penetrate in when it rains, and then it evaporates off when it dries. And a lot of the time it was just a stone wall without any finish. Sometimes they applied a lime render, but sometimes not. And also on an old stone wall, what you have with your foundations, the foundations are often quite shallow. Oftentimes they're only a couple of 100 mils deep. And you get sort of rising damp that does come up through the walls, but because the walls can breathe, that rising damp will evaporate. It can evaporate off and generally does not penetrate to the inside. The floors were oftentimes just flagstones, and if water vapor came up, it sort of it evaporated and didn't cause too much of a problem. So this is how an older building work, and they can work quite well if if they're looked after. So that is typically what you have in your house. So if I just move on, plastered breathable, they're absorbed and release moisture and evaporated at the rising damp. Okay, so if I move on here to a more modern construction, which will show you the difference between a modern construction. Modern construction here has, generally what they do is they have a cavity here in the middle of the wall, so that if any rain, now the first leaf here is shown brickwork, it doesn't have to be brickwork, it could be blockwork, but if any rain penetrates through the first leaf, it cannot go through to the inside. It'll basically fall down and will be pushed back to the outside at the bottom of the cavity. So you have a barrier there, which is your cavity, which stops moisture penetrating. Now, also what you have is you have a DPC, a damp-proof membrane. See the DPC, well, that's a DPM, a damp-proof membrane there. Damp-proof membrane, that's it there in black, which stops rising damp. And you have a DPC here, which also stops rising damp, a damp-proof course in the brickwork. So modern construction takes a very different approach, where it stops moisture from entering the building with a cavity barrier here and with a plastic membrane barrier here. And that works quite well also. Now, the problems can arise when basically someone comes along with an old stone wall and they take they modify the wall in some way and cause problems so that it cannot breathe. It can no longer breathe the way it's supposed to. And typically what happens is, a very common problem is people put a cement render on the external face of a stone wall, which is, it is what's been done in your property. There is an external cement render on it, and that will, potentially cause problems. Basically what happens with the external cement render is it's impermeable. So any rising damp that used to come up through the stone wall used to be able to evaporate out. It can no longer evaporate because the cement render here is impermeable. So it can't get out. So oftentimes what happens is it comes inside. And then what happens is sometimes people just put in a hard tanking plaster to try and deal with the moisture from the inside, but that just sometimes pushes the moisture further up the wall. And you can also have problems with, if the building is not maintained properly, if moisture is getting in at any location, for example the roof, then it can't get out because of the impermeable cement render. And another problem with these older stone buildings is people often, now this is not really relevant in your case, but I'm going to point it out just because it's something you should know. People will often put in a concrete footpath to stop the moisture getting down. It's not a good idea with an old stone building to put in a concrete footpath, because although it may, if it's designed well, it may remove a lot of the surface water, but it also prevents the ground from breathing. So there'll always be moisture in the ground, and the moisture is coming up all the time. That moisture is coming up all the time. The concrete barrier stops that moisture from getting out. So it again holds moisture in the same way that a cement render can trap moisture in a wall. It can also trap moisture in the soil. So that's not the best way of dealing with it. The best way of dealing with moisture in a stone wall is to put in a French drain. I'll discuss that later on. The other thing to point out here is with a cement render, cement renders, you have even more of a problem with cement renders if the cement render is not maintained properly. Because if it's not maintained, it can crack. And what happens when it cracks is rain that lands on the wall gets pulled into the wall and wets the wall, but it can't get out because the cement render stops the wall from breathing. So I always kind of equate it to thinking about if you have a hole in your shoe. If you have a hole in your shoe, then your sock will get wet very, very quickly, but it can't dry out because it's not able to breathe. So that's the problem that's often caused the addition of a the addition of a cement render, an impermeable cement render on a stone wall. And that's important for you to realize that, because someone has put a cement render on your building and it may cause problems. So that's just a bit of background information. Now, the other thing that can cause problems or can cause dampness, because dampness really, in older buildings in particular, dampness causes 99% of the problems that I see are all related to dampness. So if you can deal with the dampness, then you've come a long way to having a building that will work well. So this here now, the other problem that I notice, whether the building was constructed this way or whether over time this has happened, is that the external level is often higher than the internal floor level, as it is in this example. And when it's like that, now this is not an old stone wall, it's just it's a brick wall, but it's a solid wall. There's no cavity barrier, it's a solid wall, so it's good for just illustrating for my purposes. So what you have here is the ground is higher, and then if there's any moisture in the ground, it will just cross through the wall and you'll get a damp patch here. What it should be, a good detail, is that the external ground level should be about 150 millimeters or 6 inches lower than the internal floor. So it should be the opposite of the condition you have here. This ground should be lowered. So in many cases, I recommend lowering the external ground level to prevent this sort of moisture creeping in. The other effective way of dealing with dampness if dampness is an issue, is to put in a French drain around the perimeter of the building. So in this example, that French drain has been put very close to the building there, and you can see the pea gravel there. So that pea gravel is all a single size and will drain very well, and there'll be a land drain in there. Now the next page will show a diagram of it. So this is your an example here. There's your old stone wall. So that what the land drain does is it captures groundwater and brings it away quickly, but it also captures, let's say, it will lower the water table. If the water table is quite high in adjacent the area, which I suspect it may be in your property, what this will do is it will help to lower the water table. So it's a quick and easy way of solving problems with dampness. So what I say to people is very important to remember this principle. If you have dampness inside, don't try and deal with it from the inside. Always try and deal with it from the outside. Try to stop the dampness getting into the property in the first place, rather than dealing with the dampness after it's gotten in. So I see a lot of people who don't do anything outside and then just sort of put a hard tanking plaster in here, which may work for a while, but in the long run, the dampness will just push off the plaster. It'll come back. This is a much more effective way of dealing with it. And I see other areas where people inject sort of liquid damp-proof membrane into a wall. I don't recommend that either, because it's very hit and miss. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't work well. But the land drain is, it should be an easier, cheaper option, and it will work well. That's what's recommended. Generally, you're recommended to construct the land drain about 1/2 metre from the wall. Now remember, the foundations of stone walls are often very shallow, sometimes only about 200 mil or 8 inches deep. And you should never undermine the foundations. This is a 45-degree envelope, so the load from this wall will be spread at 45 degrees. So you should never dig inside this area, inside this 45-degree envelope. So that's why they have positioned it 1/2 metre away, and then they've only gone this low. He wouldn't go any lower, because if he went any lower, he might undermine the foundations. And this drain should be laid to a fall. So the formation level should be laid to a fall into a positive drainage system, so the rainwater can get away. There's no point in digging a hole and just creating a sump. That rain has to be able to get away. So that's the most effective way. So I'll summarize, and I'll finish this video one here. I'll summarize it by saying problems are often caused in stone walls by the addition of an impermeable cement render, which has happened in your case, and high ground levels, high external ground levels, which has also happened in your case. And the way I would deal with it as a first port of call, what I would do is install the French drain and lower the levels externally. Those two steps, installing a French drain and lowering the levels, and that may resolve your problems. If it doesn't, if you're still getting dampness, you may decide then at a later stage to remove the cement render and just put on a kind of a lime wash to allow the wall to breathe. Now, but it may not be necessary to go to that trouble. And there is a chance that if you remove the cement render, that it will allow moisture to get in. Now it's a bit, it's complicated. It's if you have a cement render, it prevents the groundwater from evaporating, but it does also prevent, if the cement render is maintained very well, if there's no cracks in it, it does prevent moisture ingress. So if you remove the cement render, it may be necessary to then put a lime render on the outside. But again, as I say, the first step is to put in a French drain and to lower the levels so that there's at least a 6-inch drop. Now, I'm going to just end this video here, this video one, and in the next video I'm going to discuss the roof.